You know, there is something interesting in the context of the Arab world and the issue of this war, because one of the things that many Arab commentators, you know, I've been talking to people in the Arab world, and I've been reading commentators in the Arab world, and you know, reasonable people, and they are coming with something very significant. They are saying, they are asking, didn't Hamas realize that his atrocities and barbaric attack is going to have such a severe repercussion on the people of Gaza? And didn't he realize that Hamas is a sophisticated organization in the end of the day? I mean, it was something that puzzled many people, not only in the Arab world, but I emphasize particularly the Arab world. And I also have been asked about it, you know, and so one explanation that I have in mind is Hamas views itself as a regional player. And so one of the explanations that I offered was that Hamas, as such, initiated this war because he wanted to send a message to the region saying, look, with this whole Arab-Israeli rapprochement and normalization, and particularly the growing dialogue between Israel and Saudi Arabia, Hamas, I'm sending a message to the region, and I'm saying to the people in the region, look, you can't do anything about the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without taking me, Hamas, into consideration. I have my agenda, I have my power, I have my objectives. If you will try to ignore those, I'm going to dictate, whether you like it or not, I'm going to dictate my agenda and my path. So he launched this attack guided by that. This is one explanation. I think there is another one which has to do with more the psyche of Hamas leaders, at least those who are in Gaza Strip. Look, when I'm looking at Hamas exists for almost 40 years now. It was established in Gaza Strip in the 1980s. It's coming with a very extreme, radical agenda. But in the end of the day, and particularly since 2007, when he actually took over Gaza Strip and established for himself an emirate, an Islamic emirate in Gaza Strip, Hamas looks around and say, okay, I have this emirate, I was able to position myself as a regional player, I was able to position myself as a very significant Palestinian player, but what's next? Because one of the things that Hamas constantly has been criticized by the Arab world was that in the end of the day, they said to Hamas, look, you didn't achieve any of your objectives. You didn't liberate Palestine, you didn't liberate Al-Quds, which is the Arabic name of Jerusalem, you didn't solve the issue of the Palestinian refugees, you actually failed to address almost every one of the objectives of the Palestinian people. And on top of that, you dragged Gaza Strip to havoc and destruction and death and so on, and despair and so on and so on. And indeed, in Gaza Strip, there has been growing discontent with Hamas. Because in the end of the day, the people of Gaza Strip didn't see any hope. They don't see any future because this is a closed circle dictated by Hamas. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe in a way, you know, from a psychological perspective, the psyche of Hamas leaders says, like, in the end of the day, we're kind of like trapped in this dead-end street. And we don't really see a way out of that dead-end street, because they are not going to change their rhetoric, they are not going to change their agenda, they are not going to, because they are devoted to that agenda. They are really ideologically identified with their radical agenda. We are not going to change our operational mode, meaning using violence and more violence and more violence. So in a way, Hamas finds itself trapped in some kind of like a dead-end street, particularly the leaders of Hamas in Gaza Strip. And I think that in a way, this Israeli-Arab normalization, and particularly the Israeli-Saudi dialogue, kind of like fueled sentiments of despair and frustration within Hamas leadership to the point that actually says, you know what, we don't care anymore. We're going to do something that is almost like a Samson choice. We're going to go down and bring down whatever we can going down with us. And I think that maybe that could be some sort of explanation to the answer that is constantly, frequently made in the world, and particularly in the Arab world. Had Hamas did not understand what would be the repercussion of this brutal and barbaric attack, I think that could be some sort of explanation to answer that question. And you know, talking about the Arab world, and I've been, you know, talking about the United States achievement as of now, rehabilitating its image and its role as the superpower. Something interesting, you know, only 2 weeks ago or so, when the very, I think it was the first week of the war, President Biden was here, and he was also supposed to meet with Arab leaders, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, but all those meetings back then were canceled. The background, the immediate background of that was the story of the, if you may remember, there was the story with this hospital in Gaza, Al Ahli, that was allegedly reported as if Israel attacked the hospital, and there were hundreds of fatalities, and then Western media that rushed to publish it as fact realized that that was totally not the story. It was Islamic Jihad missiles, that failed missile that crashed into this hospital or to the area next to the hospital, and there were not 300 or 500 or 900 fatalities. It was all totally inflated by Hamas, and the Western media basically didn't do their homework as they should. So that was the background why the meeting of Biden with the Arab leaders that was supposed to take the next day was actually canceled, and it didn't take place. But 2 weeks later, we see Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, standing with major Arab leaders together, shoulder to shoulder, and basically they are all coming together around this understanding that Hamas rule in Gaza Strip must come to an end. So you could see, it shows you how in that short period of time the whole dynamic was changed, and it's not by chance. It has to do with the story of, as I said, the fact that the United States of America was, because of its very clear, decisive, non-mumbling policy vis-a-vis the war, when President Biden sent a message to Iran and Hezbollah saying to them, no, don't. That was one of the reasons, I think, that fueled this change along these 2 weeks that I just mentioned before. And that brings me to say a few words also about the speech of the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, that he carried out this speech last Friday, November 3rd, I think it was. Hezbollah is the most significant proxy of the Iranian regime. It's a very significant and powerful player. Its military capacity is 10 times bigger than Hamas and Islamic Jihad combined. And since day one of this war, there has been concern regarding the question whether the Hezbollah is going to enter fully to this war. Since day one, I talked about the Iranian, the Hezbollah dilemma vis-a-vis the war. And I noted that actually the Iranian dilemma is, are they going to try to save Hamas because it's enormously significant strategic card for the Iranian regime by sending the Hezbollah to the war, trying to send Hamas, or by doing that they may jeopardize not only the downfall of Hamas but also an enormous damage to the Hezbollah? Or are they going to basically give up Hamas, give up this Gaza card with all the negative ramifications that comes for that as far as the Iranians are concerned? And one of the things that I said since the beginning of the war was that what we see is that we saw this very gradual, very well calculated military escalation by Hezbollah on the Israeli-Lebanese border, and also it was encompassed with some increasing of attacks against United States assets in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, conducted by other proxies of the Iranian regime. But those were very, calculated, well calculated, very gradual escalations on the ground that has been kind of like increasing, but not dramatically. And so today, when we look at the Israeli-Lebanese arena and the issue of the Hezbollah, what we see is this continuing and a little bit increasing skirmish between Israeli military forces and Hezbollah and other Palestinian militias in the south part of Lebanon who are obviously backed by Hezbollah. But those skirmishes are confined to the area of, roughly speaking, the Israeli northern border, the Israeli-Lebanese border, and they are not expanding to a wider geographical arena, and they are not expanding in the volume and intensity of the fight. So, in the region, in the world, people noticed that Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was totally silent for almost a month. He didn't say anything. There were reports he was meeting with leaders of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but he didn't came up speaking formally about it. And then he made a speech on Friday. And actually, when I looked at the speech, obviously I followed the speech, I listened to what he said. Nasrallah is a really master in mass psychology. He can market whatever he wants to the masses. He's a very sophisticated person, very vicious. But in course of time, Nasrallah that was, let's say, about 15 years ago or 20 years ago, Nasrallah that used to be considered as an icon in the Arab world, has lost its image because more and more in course of time, Arabs actually realized that Nasrallah is an Iranian proxy, and particularly his involvement, the Hezbollah's involvement in the war in Syria, where the Hezbollah butchered thousands of Syrians, including civilians and others. Hatred and loath in the Arab world toward Hamas, toward Nasrallah and Hezbollah increased. Remember, Nasrallah and Hezbollah actually occupied Lebanon, an Arab state from within. They basically turned Lebanon into an Iranian satellite with their weapons and the terror methods. So Nasrallah is very much loathed in wide circles in the Arab world. And for Nasrallah, the speech, I've been watching Nasrallah for many years as part of my professional background and also in my capacity as a Middle East expert. And I could say that Nasrallah was really struggling. I mean, the speech wasn't fluent. The speech wasn't as venomous as Nasrallah can be. He mumbled a couple of times. He was misspelling words. His rhetoric was moving anywhere between apologies and trying to repackage the fact that the Hezbollah is not intensively involved in the war with all kind of like apologetic view. The emotional expression in his speech was mostly reflecting, to the best of my reading, it was reflecting particularly his attempt to kind of like try and to package in a way something that is a bitter pill for him. The bitter pill for Nasrallah is that, and obviously for Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the bitter pill is that one of the things that the Iranians and their proxies market constantly to the Arab world is part of marketing themselves as if they are the ones that are going to liberate Palestine and all those slogans. One of the major concepts that they market was the story of this, what we called in Arabic, Wahdat al-Sahat, which means the unifications or unifying the arenas. And the concept says basically, look, when the time comes and there's going to be a war, all brothers, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Iraqi Shiite militias, they will all stand together shoulder to shoulder to fight this war to eliminate Israel. Well, here is this big war, very big war, where actually it's very likely that in the end of this war, Hamas will lose its power in Gaza Strip. And the Hezbollah is actually not really involved in this war. So this is the bitter pill that Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad needs to swallow, because it's already, of course, contributing to the amount of anger and hatred of many people in the Arab world towards Hamas, towards Hezbollah and Nasrallah, towards the Islamic Jihad. And you know, I was talking about the speech. Obviously, the speech has been, of course, analyzed from different perspectives, and what was said and what was not said, and so on and so on. One of the things that almost immediately captured my attention again, because since I've been following Nasrallah for many years and Hezbollah, was I noticed the script that was, when Nasrallah makes speeches, he very often has this script, some kind of like slogans that are appearing on the script when he's talking. And I noticed that he was quoting on that script a verse from the Islamic Quran. This is the Islamic Bible. And it's a verse that taken from a chapter in the Quran. It is called the chapter of Tawbah. Tawbah is a word in Arabic which means repentance or remorse. And it's interesting that he chose that specific chapter, because the meaning of this Tawbah, the repentance, is that actually a person made a big mistake and he has to now remorse because of the mistake. He basically defies Allah's will, and now he has to, you know, repent and to remorse for his mistake. The way I read that was kind of like a signal of Hezbollah to Hamas to actually, and by the way, that signal was, I think, backed by a sentence that Hezbollah says, Nasrallah says in his speech. He says, like, Hamas did not inform me about this, what they're going to do. And I'm okay with that, he says. But that was interesting, because in between the line, he basically said something like, he said to Hamas leader, he said, look, you made a unilateral act, and you made a big mistake. You didn't consult me, you didn't coordinate with me. What he didn't say, but that is the continuation of what the sentence is, that, well, you have to bear the consequences yourself. You can't expect to drag me to a war that I was not part of the decision and the initiating of this war. And indeed, the verse that Nasrallah used to quote from that specific chapter, the verse says, Allah yunsurkum alayhum, which means Allah, the God, will make you the victorious. In other words, you know, we should anticipate a divine intervention to be victorious, but not necessarily our intervention. And so I think it, and by the way, to the best of my understanding, we are today, a couple of days after the speech, I've been, again, going over reactions in the Arab world, talking with people. They basically reflect the same perspective. They are saying that was many of them are basically calling that there was a very dull speech by Nasrallah, which actually meant in the end of the day basically to provide a series of excuses. Why didn't he really committed his commitment? And he's coming with all kinds of excuses and stories, basically trying to justify the fact that in the moment of truth, Hezbollah didn't show up. He actually betrayed, if you wish, in the perspective of Hamas leaders, he betrayed them. And by the way, Hamas leaders knew that. I mean, there was a point already before the speech that they knew that Hezbollah is not going to be participating fully in this war. obviously one of the things that we have to take into consideration that this Nasrallah speech is actually a deceiving speech, and actually the Hezbollah will and plans to go full steam ahead. We have to take this scenario into consideration. Again, I mean, when you look at the situation on the ground, namely when you see that Israel is in a full alert along the border, Israel sends a very clear message to the Hezbollah that if he's going to wage a war, the consequences for Hezbollah in Lebanon are going to be severe. The US presence in the region and the very clear American message is definitely something that Hezbollah and the Iranians cannot ignore and are not ignoring. And the situation in Lebanon is a crumbling state. I mean, if Hezbollah is going to participate full steam ahead in the war, the meaning of that is that Lebanon comes to an end. What remains of this country will basically disintegrate. It may be encompassed with a civil war inside Lebanon, which, by the way, presents Hezbollah a challenge, because then he will have to divert resources and attention to what's going on inside Lebanon. So, again, not negating the possibility that this is kind of like a speech that is deliberately supposed to mislead. And I know that some people are saying that, and this is definitely something that should be considered. But again, when I look at that and I look at some of the facts on the ground, to the best of my understanding today, as of now, Iran and Hezbollah basically made a decision not to fully participate in the war. And I found it difficult to believe that the more the war in Gaza Strip evolves and Hamas downfall is becoming more and more imminent, I found it difficult to believe that by then, when Hamas downfall is imminent, at that point Hezbollah will rush into a war trying to save Hamas. I found it more difficult to believe. So my assessment as of now is that the Iranian and the Hezbollah actually took a decision not to involve in full capacity in this war.